It was a nice start. Okay.
So thank you, Giuseppe, for putting this together, and thank you for being willing to serve not just as a cop, but as in all matters European when it comes to the Scuola Sant'Anna as a much more than a moderator, as a commentator, and as a guiding mentor and friend. I would also like to thank Jelena and Tena for taking their time to join this event. And everybody else, I see some familiar faces. Well, not faces, but I see some familiar names in the audience being here. So we are here to discuss the impact of the EU, not so much the EU law, but also the EU promotion effects of the rule of law in Western Balkans. So what the EU does in order to, as a part of the European integration process, in order to promote the rule of law and in order to harmonize the legal systems of Western Balkans with that of the European Union. And this is something that has been making me somewhat anxious, and for those of you who have seen the paper, you can see these tones of sort of anxiousness and this constant willingness to prove that this is somehow not a lost cause, and that there are things there that remain to be done and that can be done in order to improve the rule of law in the Western Balkan states. So Western Balkan states: North Macedonia, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the problem that we're facing right now is the emergence of the so-called stabilitocracy paradigm, which is a term used basically to describe the last decade of the European integration of Western Balkans, where not much seems to happen. There's a sort of an exchange in legitimacy. The leaders of the Western Balkan states say that they want to join the European Union. The European Union says that there is a willingness for this to happen, or if you listen to French President Macron, that there is at least a willingness for something called a European perspective to be maintained. But there seems to be a deficit in the political will from both sides in order to fight what is the main challenge to the rule of law and its promotion in the Western Balkans, and that is the existing state capture and widespread corruption. Now, these two lacking political wills, which joined together create stabilitocracy, have a very detrimental effect, to say the least, on the lives of the peoples in the Western Balkans, because there is not just a growing brain drain, but just widespread migration towards the EU countries. There is a growing, or at least concernable, influence of other geopolitical players such as Russia, Turkey, and China in the Western Balkans. And there is also a general sort of erosion of the quality of life and the emergence of partitocracy, which is basically a rule, which is a mode of governance which allocates the positions in public institutions to those who might not have any qualifications, but they belong to a certain political option. Now, what adds problems to the general picture is the fact that these are some of the poorest countries in today's Europe, and that the economic growth, although present in all of the countries from 2014 or 15 onwards, remains insufficient in order to provide the quality of life to the general population. So when we speak about the rule of law and its promotion in the Western Balkans, and the rule of law's promotion generally as a part of the European integration project, we think of different phases of how it evolved, and how the institutions in other areas of enlargement, in other periods of enlargement, for example, the so-called Big Bang enlargement of 2004, how were the institutions and how was the rule of law built at that time. And we find when we look at the reports of the European Commission from 2002, for example, for Slovakia or for other countries, or if we look at the academic writings of many influential people like Wojciech Sadurski, we find that there was much skepticism even back then concerning what was really built in a rather short period of time. We find concerns over the widespread corruption in Central and Eastern Europe. We find concerns that constitutional courts might not be able to perform the judicial review, might not remain independent. So we find many of the topics that are present today. But still, when we discuss this enlargement, what worries me is that we are much under impression of the populist backlash, which started in 2008 and 2009. And that as a result of this, there is a growing pessimism that rule of law can be built. Now, the question why should it be built is not only a question of the general well-being of the population of the Western Balkans, it's also a sort of a matter of prestige. If you look at the attitudes towards rule of law building and its promotion in critical legal scholars and in their literature, you see that they favor this approach of sort of thinking about it as an imperialist project, as a sort of imposing the rules of the game from one empire to the periphery. And it's, I mean, how can you think about the EU as an empire or even as a sort of democracy promoter if it is unable to promote the rule of law in the Western Balkans? Now, full European integration of the Western Balkans, politically speaking, might not be even achievable in the next decade. But even if this is not so, I mean, isn't it more predictable, more certain, more economically efficient, if you like, to deal with the Western Balkans if it has rule of law, or if the rule of law is promoted there, than if it doesn't have anything? So the pessimism of the which kind of started with some of the bad experiences in rule of law promotion in, for example, Bulgaria and Romania, made a change to the paradigm, because in 2002 and 2004, it was okay just to say, okay, do you have a judicial council? Yes. Is it conformed? Have you implemented all the acquis legislation, and have you adopted all this legislation, often even not translated properly? Yes. So it was a kind of more a checklist procedure where the burden was sort of much more on the legislative bodies than on the institutions themselves. And then from 2007 to 2013, the phrase, the syntagm, rule of law and fight against corruption became a one. This is when it's hard, of course, to prove, because you would have to go to quite simply too much literature and maybe using algorithms. But earlier, it was just enough to speak about rule of law. Now, rule of law and fight against corruption, this one is as if it's a one word, became sort of the norm. So it was not just important that you have the rule of law institutions, that you have the judicial councils, the special prosecutorial offices, the auditor general, that you have the staff there that's trained to do their work, but to see whether these people are actually tackling structural corruption in these countries. And this is why you had external pressure, external political pressure, coupled with strong technical expertise transferred to the special prosecutorial bodies, contributed greatly to the big anti-corruption campaign in Romania, for example, to not so great anti-corruption campaign in Bulgaria, and to the legendary Sanader trial saga in Croatia, where the former prime minister and a very, very respected and very popular person was tried for extorting money from public money to private pockets, ultimately actually to the governing party in Croatia, the Croat Democratic Union. So you had this evolution of things. And this evolution continued when the rule of law, when the European integration moved on with concerns to Western Balkans, in a sense that now it's not only important that you have institutions and that these institutions do the work for corruption, but also that they have specific benchmarks with which you measure their progress. Benchmarks are kind of like milestones, the things that you pass, the things that measure progress, like indicators. And how would you measure this? Well, when you transpose the rules of the Chapter 23 and Chapter 24, you make special action plans, which are basically documents in which you have the desired activity of a judicial body or a judicial council or other bodies that you wish to see, and that when they reach a certain benchmark, then this is sort of a evidence of a behavior that could lead the EU to conclude that there is a sufficient existence of the rule of law standards, and consequentially a greater chance for accession to the EU and progress in negotiations and other things. The problem with the benchmarks is that they are often not just technical and imprecise, but that they move on to that they include things that are not necessarily measurable, such as trust, or measurable or very, very difficult to measure. For example, in Serbia's national plan, when you look at the benchmarks, they basically say that if the Judicial Council reacts to the political critique of the work of the judiciary, then this reaction promotes trust and is an evidence that the citizens have trust in the Judicial Council. The problem with this, of course, is that, I mean, unless you have such an anti-corruption campaign at the scale of the legendary Mani Pulite in Italy in the 90s, no single reaction or a chain of reactions that happens in a year will actually be measurable. There will be great difficulties to establish this. So at the same time, what happens with this higher expectations of work is very paradoxical. Actually, there is less and less confidence, not just in the work of the judiciary, but there is also a growing state capture of the institutions in Western Balkan countries. Not in all countries at the same level, not in the same time, perhaps not in the same way. But if you look at the last decade and try to generalize, you wouldn't make much mistake in saying that we were, in terms of trust and independence of judiciary, well, most of these countries were actually, perhaps except North Macedonia, were better off 10 years ago. And part of the reason why this is so, I think, is that there is a mistake in the promotion of the rule of law policies and in promotion of rule of law, because it chooses to ignore the constituencies, meaning those people that are in favor of the reform, those people for whom the rule of law reform is, the activists, the general population, the judges, the prosecutors, the people who work in the independent agencies. And it focuses too much on this desire, which is not specific, of course, to the European integration process. We live in this age where everything is supposed to be somehow measured by indicators of global governance and many other things. So the intention behind the benchmarks was actually to try to capture the positive effect of changes. But this focus on benchmarks, I argue, has kind of led the European delegations in these countries and the European Commission, which pumps a lot of money in terms of technical expertise to the Western Balkans, to ignore the need to construct a rule of law constituency that would actively promote and fight for the reforms. And of course, I don't want to sound naive. I worked in politics here, and I'm constantly accused wherever I go. It even happened to me when I was for 2 months in Harvard Law School, that even their professors would constantly accuse me of sounding like a politician and not being really a lawyer, and just this guy who is very too much political in his attitudes. But I do believe that what is needed is this vantage point that is offered by Professor Stephen Humphreys, who is at the LSE, I'm not sure where he is now, who has rather cynically analyzing the rule of law promotions that were done in the past by the World Bank and USAID, concluded that that the rule of law promotion is always a morality play, which happens at a theater, and that we can just imagine these people like actors who are in this horrible struggle against the bad government agents, and they fight together, although their causes are not necessarily the same. The civil society activists, the judges, the disprivileged, the poor, and that they ultimately try to improve their countries by joining the common market, by joining the global market, by basically, Humphreys doesn't say it's open, but basically by becoming agents of globalization. Now, I don't want to go so far, and I don't want to sound cynical, but I think that this vantage point and that this idea sort of is essentially accurate and essentially describes what
Mike, please. No, sorry, there was someone with the mic on. Sorry, Nedim.
Yeah, so that there's this sort of idea that what we need to do is try to see how can we use rule of law promotion in the Western Balkans, not so much for specific policies, but for mobilizing a constituency for the rule of law. And I offered in the paper 4 underdeveloped ideas, because it's a paper, it's not a book. And I offered basically 4 lines of reasoning and thinking that maybe by themselves wouldn't work. It's arguable whether they would work even if applied together. But they are, I think, a nice starting point, because only recently, and thanks like people like Tena and Jelena, have we begun really to criticize, and have we begun to really think about the new approaches that we need. So that's the debate that I'm trying to join. And there are the first idea is borrowed. Most of these ideas are in a way borrowed from an earlier period, from the 90s, and most of them follow actually what was the thinking at the time in development agencies, especially USAID. So the first idea is basically, and most of these ideas are in a way employed by the EU, but there's a lack of awareness of what can be done with them. So the first thing is the legal mobilization, which would mean essentially waging a lawfare against authoritarian practices of the regime through civil society organizations and through investigative journalism, but not in such a way that they remain sort of epistemic communities, the people who have the expertise and who are in the know and who step in when the government fails, but rather people who are there to protect other people and to mobilize other people and to protect the violation of their electoral rights, situations in which they are discriminated against because of their political views, their rights to freedom of assembly, and other fundamental rights. So Giuseppe is warning me that I'm nearing the end of my time, so I will just try to wrap up. This is something that is going on now, that does exist now, but is too much technical and too much leads to civil society organizations becoming sort of a force of their own, people that are not completely connected to the societies and places they live in. The other idea is sort of to think about agency theory in terms of reputation of the various individuals that live that work in public prosecutorial offices and in many other places that are important for the protection of rule of law. When we had this major anti-corruption campaign in Romania, it was the role of Laura Covesi, which was the lead prosecutor, which was so important. When we had Mani Pulite in Italy, it was the role of 3 or 4 magistrates and prosecutors that was really, really important and crucial in this sense. When in Brazil also, if you look and think about the role of Deltan Dallagnol in the Lava Jato affair, there is a lot to be learned in why and how were these people willing at a certain time to step in and to return to the judiciary the place that it should have in a democratic society. Well, this was partially political. So anyway, another idea is that we need to look, which is very hard for lawyers and which lawyers don't really like, is that we need to look beyond the whole rule of law paradigm, because we lack the theory that we lack a true theory of change. The theory of change with which we operate does not come from the conception of rule of law of Lon Fuller or Gianluigi Palombella or anybody else. It comes from economic development theory of Douglas North, an institutionalist, and therefore it counts too much on institutions functioning, and it hardly works in a situation where you have the level of state capture that you have. So this is why economic development can be looked at not just as something that comes when you have rule of law, but also that something that can grow rule of law itself. And the reason for this is that sometimes corruption, in particular petty corruption, comes from the scarcity of resources and the lack of resources in a society. And people are forced to bribe because they're better off bribing than not. And we must think of economic development and programs that are conducive to economic development, which are able to bypass the existing state, the existing institutions captured by the state, and which would promote private initiative and development by itself. And finally, when we think about the anti-corruption campaigns that happen in societies, there must be a way for us to sort of replicate what has happened in Slovakia in late 90s and the first decade of the 21st century with the campaign against Mečiar and his government, which with the levels of corruption and state capture was not far at all from what we see in Balkans today. Yet, in the last decade, one of the major anti-corruption success stories in the EU has been this of Slovakia, and in the aftermath of the tragic murder of Jan Kuciak. So I think that relying on these strategies might not construct the political will in the EU itself to continue with the integration project, but that it might do good to mobilize popular support for rule of law reforms here in the Western Balkans.
Okay, Nedim. Thanks indeed for the presentation. Also, thanks for saving 1 minute, because I mean you spoke 19 minutes, so perfect. I think that you raised a lot of super interesting things, and there is already food for discussion. But in the meantime, I will pass the floor to our second speaker, Professor Jelena Dzankic. Just two words about her. She's written extensively on this topic, and she does not need, I mean, a fully fledged presentation. But just let me say that she is currently part-time professor in the Global Governance program at the Robert Schuman Center of the UI. She's author of her latest book, perhaps his Global Market for Investor Citizenship. Before this book, I mean, she wrote many things about the impact of Europeanization on the Western Balkans. So she's definitely a five-star scholar, and that I'm very happy to have her on board. So, Jelena, thanks indeed for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the really wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. So thank you very much for the introduction, Giuseppe. That was wonderful, and probably I should feel embarrassed now. As you mentioned, I'm based at the Schumann Center, where I'm part-time professor, and I also co-direct the Global Citizenship Observatory at the Schumann Center, which is an online platform for the exploration of citizenship tools around the world, which I wholeheartedly invite you to visit for anything that you ever wish to know about citizenship and never dared to ask. Yet, as you mentioned, I'm here today to speak about the second prong, or if you wish, the original prong of my research, which is the transformation of society and politics in the Western Balkans, which is also something that Nedim is working on. And it is a really great pleasure for me to join you here today. And I'd also like to thank Nedim for this excellent initiative, which, as many of you know already, was supposed to take place in Pisa, but given the current circumstances, I'm actually glad that we were able to organize this. It's not Zoom, it's WebEx webinar. And obviously, thank you again, Giuseppe, for chairing this meeting, which I think is never an easy task, especially with participants that are engaged in a particular topic, and also for organizing everything that you have done for us and for this meeting to take place today. I obviously hope that there will be even more opportunities for us to collaborate, both with Sant'Anna in Pisa in the future, and also with my lovely colleague Tena, whom I've met through various other projects and initiatives. Okay, so after this very lengthy introduction, I'm going to say a total cliche in the academic world, which is I'll try to be brief. Well, we all like to say that, and we all know that that's never true in the end. So what I'll try and do in the next 15-ish, I hope, minutes is to reflect on Nedim's paper, which he has kindly shared with us a couple of weeks back, and B, I'm going to try to frame and challenge his ideas. Now, I should give you a caveat, or at least a warning. So I'm not doing any of this out of malice, so Nedim, don't take this personally, but I'm doing a harsh criticism of his ideas because Nedim has actually asked me to criticize his paper as much as possible, and I guess he never knew what he was getting himself into when he asked me that. And secondly, I would like to try to push him to transform something that I have read as an incredibly rich and descriptive paper with some normative policy feel into something that can become a strong conceptual contribution for understanding the EU's approach to the Western Balkans. So Nedim's contribution in the paper that I've had the chance to read is very important because it links two significant strands of work on the EU's external influence. So one would be the normative power of the European Union which has been projected differently in different parts of the world. And this is the stream of literature where you have to analyze the potential of the EU's foreign policy or norm export to change societies beyond Europe. And secondly, it's the literature on democracy promotion, or in this case, in particular, the promotion of the rule of law. The second major strand of literature that he tries to bring into play in this piece is the empirical work on the Western Balkan region, on its prospects for EU accession, but also area-specific literature on the EU's enlargements, the previous rounds of enlargements in Eastern Europe, compared possibly with what's going on in the Western Balkans, and also literature on the rule of law in itself in the Western Balkan region. Now, these are two major strands of literature which each have at least two substrands. And this means that what he's been trying to do is a major endeavor. And this could potentially result in an important contribution that will shed some light on A, how to better understand the dynamics and processes of EU enlargement, and B, how to situate the Western Balkan states amidst those processes. So what I would try to, in a way, invite Nedim to do is to consider a couple of things. And I'm doing this because I see his paper, the paper he shared with us, as a sort of a work in progress with quite a lot of potential. So the first thing that I would invite Nedim to do is to essentially consider what the focus of the paper is. And I guess that clearing what the focus of the paper is would help to also, in a way, remove some of the unnecessary detail from some of the sections. Because in many instances, while reading, I thought that some bits were very interesting, but then taken all together, it seemed that the paper was trying to do a little bit too much. And this is something that I always say, it's like it's better to go bit by bit than to bite off more than you can chew. The second thing that I would like to invite Nedim to do is to try and rethink, and this is perhaps very much similar to the criticism you mentioned you received in the United States. Try to rethink the so-called normative bits. Now, if you're planning to have this transformed or published as, or transformed into an academic paper, look for an analytical framework that will help us as scholars to understand processes rather than proposing solutions to the EU. That's, in a way, pushing your work towards being a policy paper and policy-related work rather than scholarly endeavor. And now, if you wish to pursue this road of turning this into a conceptual paper, and it's perfectly fine if you do not wish to do that, I would have a couple of things for you to consider. And obviously some are more important than others, and you're free to pick and choose whatever you find useful in this respect and just say, or just disregard the rest which you find would contribute less to enhancing your work. So the first issue for you to consider is, when you say the EU, who do you actually mean? Is it the European Council, Council of the European Union, the Parliament, the people and the directorates that deal with Western Balkans, national governments. Who is the EU? So I think that this is perhaps my central issue with your contribution. And I think that the paper would very much benefit from recognizing that the EU is not a singular actor. And equally, EU accession processes and the processes of EU accession and EU integration are neither a one-level game, nor are they a zero-sum game. They're not a one-level game because there's a multitude of factors that are involved in the processes of integration and enlargement. So, and I think it's perfectly fine to analyze more than a single actor within these processes. It's just important to clarify in a way from the start what you're focusing on and who does what within the enlargement process. The second issue is that I personally don't see enlargement and accession as a zero-sum game. These processes are not linear, so countries can move 2 steps forward and 1 step back, in the nice words of Paula Abdul. But the process is not a win-lose situation. It's a process which can generate very different socio-political outcomes in different contexts, and these outcomes can vary through time. Perhaps Slovakia was successful in the Mečiar issue, which you've mentioned. But as years went along, the quality of democracy in that country, in a way, declined. You know what's happened in Hungary, you know what's happened in Poland. So I think that these processes, well, if you want to speak about enlargement up until accession and then integration after accession, are very much differentiated, and dependent on quite a lot of variables that we may consider. In the case of the Western Balkans, we can also see the differences in terms of support for integration, in terms of Euro enthusiasm and Euroscepticism. Now, that's the first issue for you to perhaps consider in your future work. The second issue is perhaps the concept of stabilitocracy. Now, I appreciate the concept very much as a useful tool for understanding the EU's approach to the Western Balkans. And I think that that's precisely what its scholarly value is. Yet very often, the notion of stabilitocracy, and I had a little bit that impression in reading this paper, is often used to, in a way, criticize the EU's approach to the region. Now, obviously, there you have to also think about what another realistic alternative would be. And Nedim, in the paper, you explain very well the shortcomings of the 2004-713 enlargements, but I think that you could also consider 2 further things. One would be perhaps to acknowledge that in the last 10 years, the EU has changed a lot. It has been through at least 4 major crises, starting from the euro crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, and now COVID-19. And these are on top of issues that are caused by previous enlargement rounds. So that's one thing to perhaps consider, that the EU that was admitting Slovakia is not the same EU that you see now. It's a very different EU. And perhaps try to, in a way, consider that when conceptualizing your approach to understanding the rule of law in the region. Now, the second issue for you to perhaps consider are the deep structural problems that the Western Balkan countries face. And these are very much uncharacteristic of the earlier enlargement rounds. Now, think about the example that you've given about the EU that should, in a way, try to replicate the campaign from the 90s to bring Mečiar down. I don't think that's realistic because unlike the Central and East European countries, despite the fact that the levels of state capture are the same, unlike the Central and East European countries, Western Balkan states are A, post-conflict, which the Central and East European ones are not, post-violent partitions. So it wasn't like Czech Republic and Slovakia, hi, it was nice being married to you, bye-bye. It was far worse. And the second is that the Western Balkan states have been placed in a sort of a transitional limbo for the last 30 years. And from the early 90s until the late 90s, the level of state capture is perhaps, let me put it like this, it seemingly might be the same level, but I guess 30 years allow you to capture states much, much better than 7 to 8 years from the start of transition. So I think that in a way, we can think about the mechanisms from the late 90s, early 2000s that were applied and that were successful, yet we also have to consider the validity of those mechanisms in the context of the Western Balkans. And now it's kind of back to stabilitocracy. I've put down as a reminder here a sort of a provocative question for Nedim, which is, imagine you had neighbors. Would you prefer them to be corrupt or violent? So this is, in a way, I guess, also a dilemma that that the EU is facing with the Western Balkans. And it's kind of, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the EU is right or wrong in its approach. I'm just trying to factor in some explanatory variables as to why things that used to work some 20, 25 years ago are no longer working. The final issue, the final point, and I hope that I'll not go over time, that I wanted to, in a way, put forward in your direction is the whole stream of literature on the so-called fake compliance. Because when I was reading your paper, what was coming out of it was the whole discourse also by Gargana, Nucheva, etc., on fake compliance, but I've never seen the words in your paper. So it would be interesting to see whether what you're describing here can be framed in the context of fake compliance, and then you essentially explore the notion of fake compliance through the lenses of, let's say, a combination of enlargement and accession fatigue. So on the EU side, it's internal problems. On the Western Balkans side, the protracted political transition. So I'm just kind of fleshing out some ideas for you to carry this forward. So I think that I'll leave it at that for now. In case you or anyone have any questions, I'm super happy to follow up. And also, Nedim, feel free to send me any additional drafts of the paper. Glad to give you feedback. And I hope to have provoked you, as you were asking for it, enough, and that I've given you plenty of food for thought on how to essentially rework this very promising piece into a really, really valuable contribution. So now I'll really stop, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks indeed, Jelena, for these very helpful comments. I do agree with you, especially on one of the latest points you raised about the necessity also to frame the think of the conditionality and the enlargement in a diachronic perspective. So you are absolutely right in my view. So Nedim will have time, of course, I mean, to react, but I want to tame his nature now, and I want to pass the floor to our third speaker, Tena Prelec. She is currently based at the University of Oxford, at the Department of Politics and International Relations, but she's also research associate at the London School of Economics, among other things. She has also written a lot about related topics, about Western Balkans in particular. And I'm very happy to have her here. So thanks indeed for accepting our invitation, and ready where you are. Thank you very much, Tena.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe, for this kind introduction. And of course, thank you, Nedim, for the invitation. And thank you, Jelena, also for setting the scene in such a great way. Can I just check that you can hear me well and everything is fine? Yeah?
Very well, very well.
Fantastic. So without further ado, I will start with commenting on Nedim's paper. So while I agree with much of what Jelena has said, my comments will go probably in a bit of a different way. If you will, I will speak more from the heart, trying to recognize what was it that motivated Nedim's paper, and that I think that chimes a lot with what motivates much of my scholarship. And so I will try to suggest ways on how to do that better, basically. So I guess it's another not so uncommon thing in academia that will happen today, that you get two people telling you two completely different things, and then you see what to do with it. But basically, my main takeaway after hearing what Jelena had said earlier is that I possibly see at least two outputs from this paper. It's so rich that and so problematic, because it raises such problematic topics that you might be actually better off in splitting it in more than one outcome. But okay, I'll get to that. So first of all, just in a general way, I really applaud Nedim's bravery in tackling this topic as he did, because I mean, as he mentioned, from a scholarly perspective, the topic of rule of law promotion in the Western Balkans is, it's something that we've been discussing a lot, but usually we stick to the criticism of what does not go well. And I mean, much of the reason that use scholarship, you need to have a proper framework, as Jelena, has so painstakingly addressed and explained. So also, as Nedim was mentioning, that he always gets this criticism of being a bit too political, etc. This does not go down so well in certain or in most actually academic milieus, and yet, that leaves us in a bit at the margins, that leaves us in a position of just basically criticizing and not advancing the scholarship so much in terms of what are the avenues for democratization. So I think this is the frustration from which Nedim's paper starts, and I very much share this frustration. So I really do applaud, his bravery in trying to say, okay, here what I'm trying to do is actually to go beyond and try to tackle it. And the second general point is that I also think it's a very well-written piece, which is not incredibly common in academia. So well done for that. And I'm happy to provide more feedback in writing, of course, in terms of everything I say now. So I'll start with the points you make in terms of the analysis, and then I'll get to your proposals. Yeah. So first, in terms of the analysis, I think you raise a lot of really good points. Indeed, maybe sometimes even too many. So that point that Jelena raised is valid in terms of the topic being so rich that that really you should think about the focus. But nevertheless, I think some of the points you raise are excellent, and I'll go through them. So one of the things, so actually this doesn't, you don't spell it out so clearly, but I think it comes out from your introduction that basically, the whole transition paradigm, as we've been conceiving it, as these countries of Eastern Europe going from a situation which is basically bad in terms of democracy, yeah, from like a command economy and from a monoparty system towards a bright future of multipartitism, democracy, and a market economy that functions. This whole transition mechanism paradigm might be misguided in a way, because we're always saying, oh, the transition countries, but transitioning to what? And is it really, has transition finished, but has it actually, even useful at all to say that they're still transitioning? Is it a linear process? It might, not be the case, and we really, I think, we need to go beyond that and to accept the complexity of this issue, especially in the light of the fact that there has been such a big democratic backsliding over the past decade, and this is I think incontrovertible and really shown by a lot of the scholarship and of the international indicators and so on. Then something else that you highlight is the other issue of the European Union being presented as kind of the bogeyman of what is not working in the Balkans, that this is misguided. And I think you're right in saying that, meaning that we can all agree with the fact that there have been massive shortcomings in terms of how EU institutions and EU countries' leaders have been approaching rule of law promotion in the Western Balkans, but this should not make us go to the other extreme and saying that the EU is a bad actor in the Balkans. I think that it is needed to recognize the fact that at the end of the day, the advancements also in terms of transparency, etc., they were by and large guided by rule of law promotion from the EU and also from some other Western countries, etc. So that's why also I think this topic is indeed important. You also mention that EU countries themselves have problems with the rule of law now, which is also an important point. You mentioned Poland and Hungary, etc. And also in general you highlight this paradox that the more robust and nuanced the approach to rule of law became, the less success it had in achieving its aims. So I think you might, you might have to explain that a bit more, meaning that, I mean, maybe I missed it, but I think that, this issue of the less success it had, the more it became I don't know, shortcomings in the technicalities of the process, but rather I would say it's due to the general progressive erosion of the attractiveness of the EU model. And you recognize that then saying that there is this need to act on dismantling state capture, which is your key point, and it's very, very well made, I think. But I think, you know, you should reflect a bit more on why it didn't have the success, and sort of be more precise about that. Then you also mentioned something that is not often recognized, the fact that in the early years of transition, if you want to call it this way, there was a lot of focus on the prosecution of war crimes. And this is absolutely understandable, and it was necessary. And yet you say that this drained a lot of energy and time for the rule of law promotion. Now, I think this is, you know, this is quite important and actually not highlighted in a lot of works. And I mean, this is something that I also felt the need to highlight in my PhD. And not only, you know, not only the fact that there was a lot of institutional focus on the prosecution of war crimes rather than on rule of law issues, but also in terms of the scholarship and of the analysis, also of the media attention and policy attention in general on the region. For a long time, we have focused on, you know, on the war, on conflict, on ethnic hatreds, on disproving that there were ethnic hatreds, and all these topics. And in the meantime, we have really missed the boat to analyze all these really important issues that have brought to state capture today. Yeah. So you mentioned privatization and the role this had in, you say, coming up with, you know, state capture and also partitocracy. So that is absolutely key. And again, I mean, this is also something that you might, you know, want to sort of define a bit better. So what exactly you mean by partitocracy, and why you choose to focus on the role of the party as the key actor rather than maybe, you know, elites. So these two things. But in general, this point, you know, I think it's well made of the focus at the beginning being in another part, and this entailing this sort of vicious circle today. Also, you mentioned that economic growth does not mean necessarily curbing down corruption. This is key, and this is something that that used to be very much, and I think it's still today, to be honest, a neoliberal myth. The fact that, you know, that corruption is bad for business, is bad for growth, etc., etc. This is really not true, and there is a whole literature that you could draw on to make this point stronger. So, for instance, Keith Darden has analyzed graft and corruption in Ukraine specifically, basically showing that in certain circumstances, corruption can actually reinforce state institutions, can reinforce the solidity of the state rather than make it weaker. And today, I mean, we see that very clearly in Serbia, like and partially in Montenegro too. But the Serbian president is very, very proud of the economic success that he's brought to Serbia, or presumed so, because also it's very easy to manipulate with these indicators. But basically, you know, this economic success is a big feature of his narrative of why they're doing a good job with Serbia. And yet, you know, if you go just a bit below the surface and you analyze what happens really, who does this economic success benefit? It doesn't benefit the whole population. It really doesn't. It actually ends up reinforcing the very same elites. I mean, I'm about to publish something on something similar on this topic, in which I analyze the extractive practices in terms of the foreign investments, you know, so foreign investments, or presumed so, coming from countries such as Russia or the Emirates, but not only. So it's not only non-Western countries, but in these cases, it's easier for this to happen. And how, you know, these non-transparent, basically, dynamics, they favor the fact that that this money, you know, is not redistributed equally among the whole population. You know, the point economic growth versus corruption point is worth examining a bit more, because it's still something that is quite misunderstood, and I think it's super important. And then something that Jelena also picked up on really nicely is this notion of fake compliance that you hint to. So this fact that, that it has been possible by and large for the leaders of the region, so by and large for the illiberal leaders of the region, to accept only the formal parts of the acquis communautaire of the EU, without actually like getting rid of the political influence in these economic sectors, etc., etc. And the example you make is the one of the energy sector, which is very, very fitting. So, improving the legislation, of course, does not mean that in-depth transformation is made. And so, all in all, you make this point that there is the need to be more realistic about the achievements that we aim for. So this is one key point that you make. And then the other one that I like very much, that I'll get on later, is this point that you hint to the need ultimately to create constituencies of actors that will redress this very complicated balance of state capture that you reconstruct in your paper. So this is for the part of the analysis, some feedback to that. Now, in terms of your proposals, as you say, you draw upon scholarship of several different academics, and you highlight some proposals that you think to be useful. So one that you mentioned is legal mobilization, meaning that civil society organization, etc., sometimes act, as actors of advocacy and lobbying to get also to legal changes in the legal framework of the countries. And here you mentioned the whistleblower legislation of in Serbia. So yes, good, but I'm wondering whether the name you decided to give to this proposal is the correct one, because in a way, the lobbying and advocacy work of the CSOs is wider than only specifically the legal one, the one aimed at implementing the laws. So I had sort of a question mark over that. And I think that here, you also mentioned quite effectively the limitations of this, of the activism of CSOs. And specifically, you mentioned the fact that they are being attacked from governments in many cases, because they're being presented as actors of the West, actors of, Sorossoids, etc., which is not unlike something that is happening in Hungary, for instance. But anyway, they're being discredited due to these dynamics. So here is the potential and the limitation. Then another one that you mentioned is this institutional strengthening with a specific focus. So basically, you argue that there is the need for tailor-made mechanisms to for first an in-depth diagnosis to address specific issues in each country. And on this, you mentioned the PRIBE reports that were done. The PRIBE report, the first for North Macedonia, and actually there was one for Bosnia, if I'm not mistaken, something similar that has happened lately. So this I also find, I completely agree with that. We did mention this in the work that I co-authored with Jovana Marovic and Marko Kmezic, and also the good folks at the Belgrade Center for Security Studies have done a specific report on that specifically. So definitely there is the need for a proper diagnosis before you can implement policy actions. And also like this whole idea of institutional strengthening with a specific focus, I find it important. So that's also another area that I try to tackle in that report, that BFAG report, in which I've analyzed specifically the problems related to elections, which are one part of this whole game of why, at the end of the day, it's so difficult to get out of this vicious circle of the weaknesses of rule of law in the also mentioned the possible kind of politicization of anti-corruption, and something that you mentioned in your presentation here, like Mani Pulite, etc. And you mentioned now Lava Jato in Brazil. Now, I just I was actually reflecting on this because I watched that really interesting documentary on Brazil lately, which is, hello, can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. So basically, like, it's interesting how, you know, this activism of the judiciary in Brazil, which is by and large praised, has actually then brought to the ascent of Bolsonaro in Brazil. It has opened the way for him, and actually one of the main prosecutors became the Minister of Justice under Bolsonaro. So I'm just, you know, it just makes me think, it just pauses that anti-corruption efforts are not necessarily leading us in the right direction unless there is a proper fabric underneath. Yeah. So in that sense, I think that, you know, your main idea, the idea that you're putting forward here, that that basically we need to work with the constituencies of actors that are well present in the Balkans, who are keen on you know, on something that we would define as European values or democratic values. So something that is in direct opposition, let's say, to this issue of state capture, of you know, the elites basically keeping the whole machine of the political and economic machine of the countries for their own advantage. So you make this proposal of basically, you know, looking towards that direction, towards empowering these constituencies of actors. So I think this is, you know, a very strong central idea, and something that chimes basically with the conclusions of my own PhD. And I would encourage you to look at the concept of accountability ecosystems that has been advanced in some policy circles, like Transparency International, etc., in which basically, you know, it's this idea of a group of different actors that joining forces together can really do a much better job in keeping the system in check and spearheading change further down the line. And to these group of actors that you already mentioned before in your presentation, I would also add the new diaspora, because we see, you know, that the patterns of migration are changing, and that by and large there is a different way in which the new diaspora members, so voters that are out of the country, are perceiving politics, and they are by and large today disempowered and not so keen, you know, to act in the political processes. But it would be interesting, you know, to think about how this can be changed. So, you know, to sort of to conclude, basically, you know, Jelena has suggested you to go towards a way which is precise, that gets you to publish your paper in a good journal, etc. And I still think that probably you should follow her suggestions to achieve that aim, because there is so much in your paper, and you definitely can write a journal article that ticks all the boxes of important and good journals, and that can be published there and make a good contribution to the literature, etc., etc. But on the other hand, I would also encourage you to not, you know, give up on what was the passion that made you sit down and write this very complex and interesting paper. And I mean, in a way, there is, you know, not abandoning. So one option would be to make a policy paper out of it, reflecting on all these issues and really focusing maybe on one of these proposals that you highlighted and fleshing it out more. But so, you know, aside from a policy paper, I think there is also a scope for us as scholars to reflect on the notion of militant sociology that Pierre Bourdieu has, you know, put forward, and that authors such as Nancy Scheper-Hughes have taken forward. Meaning that, you know, it comes at the end to the basis of our epistemology, etc. Are we as scholars only trying to analyze the situation, or do we also want our scholarship to be something that spearheads change, etc.? So possibly, only possibly, there is also, you know, provocative scholarly paper to be written in here. on this tendency you seem to have encountered over and over again in your scholarly life of, of your peers and your superiors telling you you're too political, and to kind of, provocatively put forward to them, okay, but has scholarship on this topic so far achieved, so what are our aims? And has scholarship so far achieved these aims? And can we do it better? And can we use maybe these principles, such as the one that I just mentioned, and maybe others? So, these are my main points. And basically, I think that your contribution is telling us to change the way rule of law promotion works in the Western Balkans. It's not enough just to tick the boxes, to do something mechanical, but really what is needed is to overturn the zeitgeist. The spirit of the times is to get people really motivated to take part in the democratic process. And we need a bigger investigation and wider investigation of how we get there. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll stop here.
Thanks indeed, Tena, for these stellar points. I think that you raised a lot of very good points that should be taken into account by our common friend Nedim. So I already have a question from the audience, but Nedim, you are the boss. Do you wanna, let's say, to gather all the questions, first, or do you want to immediately react to the points raised by Jelena and Tena? What do you think, Nedim?
Well, I will just react briefly now.
All right.
So thank you, both of you, for these wonderful and thoughtful points, and for taking the time to read something that really, as Jelena said, tries to do too much. And yeah, this is especially useful, this point of fake compliance, because I left this out deliberately, not by chance, because I felt that there was already, probably because while I was writing this, I felt very pessimistic about this thing actually being put into practice and then sort of lifting off and taking its life. So I felt that if I add even the fake compliance problem, that added to, if we add that to the existing problem of state capture, and if we add that to the existing deep structural problems with which the countries are faced, then it kind of makes the whole writing sort of naive. It is not for nothing that the strand of literature to which Jelena referred to as democracy promotion and I would add waning normative power of the EU in the region, it is not for nothing that I rely on this literature, because there's not much to rely on. If you want to argue for a sort of strengthening of the rule of law promotion, because it would have been much, much more easier to write a provocative paper saying, well, let's just abandon this integration project because it will not succeed. So it's kind of, in writing this, of course, not all of these ideas are probably well thought of and well developed, and there's too much of them, but it's very hard to sort of write something that, even if it was a policy paper, to write something that's kind of sets out this sort of positive, optimistic idea that you can actually, thanks to the external influence, greatly change the existing rule of law paradigm in the Western Balkans. So yeah, with that in mind, I would also like to thank for this Keith Darden. I tend to read a lot of literature on anti-corruption. I have missed this. And also I will definitely check this accountability ecosystems idea, because I think that it definitely sounds as something that should be used here. So yeah, we'll continue later, but then let's go now for the question.